All right, so finally, the last topic addressed in this chapter is going to be general recommendations for how much of these things we should eat, or at least a look at where those numbers come from. So how are we studying nutrition and how are we determining how much we need? So we have a few different values referred to as dietary reference intakes, or your DRI, for these foods. And these are general uh, values that essentially tell you how much is too little, how much is just right, how much is too much, and then how much is really dangerous based on our analysis of the population in general. So the four important DRIs to be aware of are our estimated average requirement. This is describing the amount of some nutrient that is supposed to be sufficient for the average person. So the EAR should be enough for about 50% of the population. We then have the recommended dietary allowances. This is probably our most important value to pay attention to here because this is representing the amount of a nutrient that is sufficient for about 95% of the population. So in general, you should be aiming to meet the recommended dietary allowance for every single nutrient every single day. And if you're doing that, that should be sufficient, at least for 95% of us, to function and do everything that we need to do. Right? So that's still not addressing 5% of the population, right? That's not enough for everybody. But in general, this is the most important value to try to meet. We have adequate intake, which is the hypothesized, essentially the lowest amount of some nutrient that would be required on a day-to-day basis in order to prevent disease from nutrient deficiency. So if you are consuming below the adequate intake level, you're likely building up a deficiency that might show up as a disease or disorder either very soon or somewhere down the line. And so that is the minimum that you should be consuming. And then we have our tolerable upper intake level. And this is essentially representing the maximum. So if you are going above the tolerable upper intake level, you're now risking disease or disorder from consuming too much of that nutrient. So it's all a balance. You can't just overconsume everything and expect to be fine, and you certainly can't underconsume everything and expect to be fine. So we have adequate intake, which is our low number. So you need to be consuming at least this adequate intake level of the nutrient in order to prevent diseases from deficiency. We have our estimated average requirement, which should be enough for 50% of the population, but isn't necessarily enough to prevent disease. We have our recommended dietary allowance, which is what you should be aiming for, at least for 95% of the population. So try to meet your RDA for every nutrient category. And then we have our tolerable upper intake level. So this is the maximum. So you want to be somewhere in between your RDA and your UL. So above what is necessary for 95% of the population, but below that upper intake level where you would start risking disease or disorder from having too much. And then our last two acronyms to become familiar with here, the estimated energy requirement, that's essentially your recommended amount of calories to consume each day. And then we have our acceptable macronutrient distribution range, which is describing where those calories should come from. Okay? So these DRIs could refer to any nutrient. So whether that's a macronutrient, a micronutrient, or water, you should be able to find these values for all of them. Whereas this EER, this estimated energy requirement, is just talking about calories. This is just macronutrients. And then your AMDR is just talking about macronutrients, right? This is where your calories are coming from. And so it has become generally accepted that 45 to 65% of the calories that you consume each day are supposed to be coming from carbohydrates. And I know I talked about sugar and that anything referred to as a sugar is a carbohydrate. This doesn't mean that you should just be eating a bunch of sugar, a bunch of pure sugar, and that all your calories should come that way. This is referring to complex carbohydrates, things like fiber, things like starches and grains that aren't going to have other negative impacts on things like your insulin levels and diabetes. So we'll get more into the specifics of types of carbohydrates much later, but I just want to clarify this is not just talking about going and eating spoonfuls of sugar. So in general, carbohydrates should be contributing to a majority. of your energy intake. Fats should contribute at 20 to 35%. See, fats are important. We're not supposed to be cutting them out of our diet. We just need to be conscious of what types of fat we're consuming and not let that become the majority of where our energy is coming from. And then protein should be your lowest impact here. I think especially in the United States, protein culture has become a bit of a fad, and we tend to overconsume protein and underconsume carbohydrate. And that's supposed to be flipped. Protein is supposed to be the lowest contribution to your energy intake, depending on activity level. If you do a lot of exercise, then protein is necessary to upkeep with that muscle burning and building. But in general, protein should be the lowest as far as energy intake, followed by fat and then carbohydrates making up the most. And lots of different factors are going to impact how much energy your body needs to upkeep itself throughout the day. So overall mass, a larger person requires more energy to maintain their body than a smaller person. And type of mass plays an even bigger role there, where lean mass, your muscle tissue, requires much more energy than fat mass, right, adipose tissue. Exercise, if you're doing it or not, and then what type of exercise. Those two things are going to play a big role in your energy intake because you burn energy in order to do exercise, and so you have to replenish that energy. And then age and sex both are going to have a big role in your energy intake. Your life stage, if you are still developing, you need more energy because you are building new body pieces. As you get later in life, your body is going to start degenerating, having less body mass to upkeep, and so you need less energy. And then there is some impact related to like hormones and development with biological sex that do play a role in your overall energy needs as well. But that's a lot more complex if we start considering things like hormone therapy, etc. So that part is we can probably ignore to some extent. But those other factors are going to play a big role in your energy needs. And so lastly here, how nutrition is studied, right? Like I said at the very beginning of this chapter, an important thing to keep in mind throughout this course is that nutrition is not as well studied as we would like it to be. Nutrition is not as well understood as we would like it to be. And it's honestly like barely considered a real science because it is so anecdotal and differs so much person to person. A well-designed research study in science would include a large sample size, thousands of individuals, would be a double blind, meaning that there are some individuals that are receiving treatment, some individuals that are not receiving treatment, and the researcher doesn't know who is who, so that they can be completely objective in their analysis of the data, and would produce causational relationships, not just correlational. And that last part is what is most difficult to do in nutrition. In order to form a causational relationship, you need to be able to control everything about the study subject, including the variable that you're studying. So if we wanted to determine what a perfect diet is, we would need to have a large population of people, thousands of people, that are doing the exact same amount of exercise, the exact same activity, the exact same amount of sleep, that have the exact same genetics, that have the exact same behavior and social circle, and the only thing different about them is their diet. And if we were able to do that, then we could get some really useful information. But that's impossible to do. Right? It's impossible to control everything about a human. It's not it's very immoral to try to do that, even if it would be theoretically possible. And so very little nutritional advice is actually based on good science. Most of our nutritional advice is coming from observational research, where we look at a population, we try to gather some data on what food does that population typically eat. So like pasta is much more common in Italy than it is in somewhere like Russia. And so these people are eating pasta, which is mainly carbohydrate based, and maybe this population in Russia is mostly eating protein with very little carbohydrate. And then we compare what types of diseases are common in this population versus that population. And then we come up with a correlational relationship. Right? That's really weak science, but most of our understanding of nutrition is coming from research like that. And so our recommendations are just based off of observation, not based off of actual studying with a controlled setting, right? Laboratory research where we have control over everything the subject is doing and we can very discreetly and specifically manipulate different variables. That is good science. We can do that with study subjects, models like rats and mice or other mammal study models, but we can't really do that with humans. So we can do these small clinical trials, which is probably some of the strongest information we have, but that doesn't necessarily address all of these criteria for a well-designed research study. They're typically very small sample sizes. And again, you can't control everything about a human to actually get that causational relationship. So studying nutrition is hard. And so giving general advice about nutrition is difficult. And like I said, I'm going to do my best throughout this course to identify for you which things are actually backed by good science and which things are maybe helpful, maybe unhelpful. And so we'll try to navigate this information together. But at the end of this course, hopefully you will have at least a strong understanding of what is in your food, a general understanding of what we know from the science as being healthy and potentially being unhealthy. And then you'll have a few tools and skills in your tool belt to be able to navigate this and make decisions for yourself. Because at the end of the day, you're going to need to experiment with different foods, see how your body feels. Are you capable of doing all the things that you want to do on a day-to-day basis? And do you feel good about it? And make choices for yourself. So anyways, that's all for this chapter. Thanks for coming along this journey with me. I'll see you in the next one.